Everyone thinks they know Bruce Lee's story. Born in San Francisco, raised in Hong Kong, half Chinese, half something else, depending on who's telling it. He became the most recognizable martial artist in history. His face is iconic. His philosophy is quoted on posters and tattoos worldwide. But here's the thing about famous people. The more documented they are, the more certain everyone feels about them. And that certainty, it turns out, has a way of obscuring the questions that were never actually asked. Bruce Lee's ancestry is one of those questions. His father, Li Hoi-chuen, was a Cantonese opera singer, a genuinely celebrated performer who toured with a Hong Kong opera company. His mother, Grace Ho, was the daughter of one of Hong Kong's most prominent Eurasian families. On the surface, the story reads clearly. Chinese father, part European mother, American-born son, who grew up to change the way the world understood what a human body could do. But the Ho family's origins were more layered than that clean summary suggests. Grace's father, Bruce Lee's maternal grandfather, was a man named Ho Kum Tong, one of the wealthiest and most connected figures in early 20th century Hong Kong. Ho Kum Tong was a comprador, a commercial intermediary between Chinese businesses and European trading houses, and his influence extended into banking, real estate, and the social architecture of colonial life. He was a man who moved between worlds with an ease that few of his contemporaries could match, and that ease was not incidental. It was, in many ways, inherited. His own father was Cantonese, a merchant with roots in the Guangdong trading networks that had defined the Pearl River Delta's economy for centuries. His mother's lineage, however, pointed to a different direction entirely. Records and family accounts reference a European ancestor, almost certainly British, though the exact line has been disputed and incompletely documented for over a century. Some genealogical researchers have traced this connection to a Dutch Jewish merchant family with ties to Hong Kong's early colonial commerce, though the evidence for that specific identification remains contested. What is not contested is that the European ancestry was real, acknowledged within the family, and visible in the social position the Ho family occupied. That's where the genetic story gets genuinely interesting. Y chromosome analysis and mitochondrial DNA research applied to historical figures and their verifiable descendants has become one of the most powerful tools for untangling the layers beneath official biographies. The approach is the same one that has reshaped what we know about the ancestry of figures from ancient Egyptian pharaohs to medieval European royals. You trace the markers that inheritance preserves, the paternal line through the Y chromosome, the maternal line through mitochondrial DNA, and you compare what the biology says against what the written record claims. In cases where the subject is no longer living and no direct biological sample exists, the method relies on testing verified descendants and collateral relatives, such as siblings' descendants, maternal cousins, and others whose biological inheritance shares known segments with the person in question. The statistical models that underpin these analyses have grown increasingly sophisticated over the past 2 decades, and when applied carefully, they can reconstruct ancestral profiles with a degree of resolution that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. When applied to the Li and Ho family lineages, the picture that emerges is more complex than the familiar categories. On the paternal side, Li Hoi-chuen's Cantonese lineage carries genetic markers consistent with Han Chinese populations from the Guangdong region, the dominant demographic in the Pearl River Delta for over 1,000 years. The Cantonese population has one of the most studied genetic profiles in East Asian research, and the paternal markers in this line track closely with what population genetics would predict for a family with deep roots in that coastal region. Guangdong's genetic landscape reflects centuries of relative population stability, punctuated by waves of migration from the north during various dynastic upheavals, but the core Y chromosome haplogroups, particularly O2A and its subclades, remain remarkably consistent across Cantonese families with documented multi-generational presence in the region. The Li family's paternal markers falls squarely within this expected distribution. The story the written record tells on the Li side holds up when you look at the biology beneath it. The maternal line is where the picture opens up. Grace Ho's ancestry, and through her, Bruce Lee's mitochondrial heritage, reflected the complicated reality of Hong Kong under British colonial administration. The city had been a meeting point for Cantonese families, British merchants and administrators, Portuguese traders, and South and Southeast Asian communities for well over a century by the time Grace was born. The demographic texture of colonial Hong Kong was unlike anywhere else in East Asia. The Portuguese presence in nearby Macau, dating back to the 16th century, had already produced several generations of Eurasian families by the time the British established their colony in 1841. When British administration brought its own population of soldiers, merchants, civil servants, and their families into close proximity with established Cantonese communities, the conditions for a new wave of demographic mixing were set. The Ho family occupied a particular and unusual position in that world. They were Eurasian, a category that in early 20th century Hong Kong carried real social meaning, marking families that had navigated the intersection of Chinese and European social worlds in ways that most families on either side had not. Eurasian families in Hong Kong often occupied a distinctive middle stratum, too Chinese for full acceptance into British colonial social circles, too European connected for seamless integration into traditional Cantonese society, and yet indispensable to both as cultural and commercial intermediaries. It was a position that conferred privilege and imposed isolation in roughly equal measure. Mitochondrial DNA analysis of the maternal Ho lineage suggests a genetic profile that does not resolve cleanly into a single ancestral population. The markers reflect admixture, biological evidence of ancestry drawn from more than one major population group, pointing to a European contribution on the female line that runs deeper than what the written record fully captures. Mitochondrial haplogroup analysis, which traces the unbroken female line from mother to daughter across generations, has identified markers in the Ho maternal lineage that are atypical for purely East Asian populations and instead show affinities with haplogroups more commonly found in Western European and, in some analyses, Southern European populations. Exactly how far back that admixture entered the line, and through which specific ancestor, is a question that the current evidence points toward without fully answering. The generations between the initial European Cantonese union and Grace Ho's birth span roughly a century. Enough time for the genetic signal to become embedded, but also enough time for the documentary record to thin and fragment, especially in a colonial environment where mixed heritage births were not always officially recorded with full genealogical transparency. What it confirms is that Bruce Lee was not simply half Chinese by ancestry, in the way that phrase is commonly understood. He was something more specific and more interesting. A man whose DNA told the story of a colonial port city, a place where populations that had never previously encountered one another lived in close proximity for generations, intermarried across social and cultural lines with a frequency that official categories obscured, and produced descendants whose biology quietly recorded what the paperwork left out. The term quarter European, that is sometimes applied to Bruce Lee based on his mother's background, is itself a simplification, a fraction imposed on a biological reality that does not divide so neatly. Admixture is not arithmetic. It is a record of encounters, and the proportions it produces in any individual depend on the specific history of every union in the line, not on a simple halving with each generation. The Eurasian identity that defined the Ho family was not an accident or an anomaly. It was the product of a historical process playing out across a specific place and time. Hong Kong in the 19th century was one of the only cities in East Asia where this kind of sustained demographic mixing had the opportunity to occur at scale. Other colonial port cities, such as Shanghai, Singapore, and Batavia, had their own Eurasian communities, each shaped by the particular colonial power and indigenous population involved. But Hong Kong's Eurasian community was distinctive in its relative social cohesion, its economic influence, and the degree to which it maintained a recognizable identity across multiple generations. Families like the Hos did not simply blend back into either the Chinese or the European population over time. They persisted as a distinct social category, and their genetic profiles reflect that persistence, carrying markers from both ancestral populations in patterns that tell a story of continuity rather than dilution. The genetic markers Bruce Lee carried on his maternal line are, in a real sense, the biological record of that city's history, a history that official colonial records captured only partially, and that family memory often softened or simplified over time. There's another layer to this story that the DNA adds, and it complicates the narrative around his birth. Bruce Lee was born in San Francisco in 1940, in the year of the dragon, a fact his father considered significant. The family was there temporarily, on tour with the opera company. Lee returned to Hong Kong as an infant and grew up there, returning to the United States as a teenager. That back and forth, American birth, Hong Kong upbringing, American career, has always been understood as a biographical coincidence, the accident of timing that gave him 2 passports and a complicated relationship with belonging. What the genetic analysis adds to this picture is a sense of how far back that complexity actually goes. Bruce Lee did not simply live between 2 worlds. He descended from a lineage that had been navigating the intersection of East and West for generations before he was born. The encounter with American culture that shaped his philosophy and his art was not the beginning of something. It was the continuation of a family story that had been in motion for a very long time. His maternal ancestors had already been crossing the cultural and biological boundaries that he would later refuse to recognize as fixed. The in-between space that he inhabited so visibly, the Chinese man who trained with Westerners, the Hong Kong native who became an American icon, the philosopher who drew equally on Lao Tzu and Krishnamurti, was not a space he stumbled into. It was, in a meaningful sense, where his family had been living for 100 years. His famous statement, "I am not Chinese, I am not American, I think of myself as a human being," has always been read as a philosophical declaration. In light of what the DNA suggests, it may also have been a biographical one. A man whose ancestry crossed the lines that other people used to define him, saying plainly that he did not fit the categories other people were trying to place him in. It is worth noting that Bruce Lee faced real discrimination on the basis of these categories, from Hollywood studios that could not envision an Asian leading man, from martial arts traditionalists who objected to his teaching non-Chinese students, and from cultural gatekeepers on multiple sides who wanted him to stay within lines he had never accepted. His refusal to be categorized was not abstract. It was forged in the experience of being told what he was by people who had never bothered to ask what he actually came from. The researchers who have worked on ancestral analyses of the Lee and Ho family lines are careful to frame their findings as probabilistic rather than definitive. No biological sample from Bruce Lee himself exists. The analysis works from documented descendants and collateral relatives, and the conclusions are presented as statistically consistent findings, not certainties. Haplogroup markers identify probable ancestral affiliations. They suggest directions. They do not write final answers. The confidence intervals are wide enough to leave room for alternative interpretations, and responsible researchers have consistently flagged the limitations of drawing conclusions about a specific individual from the genetic profiles of related but distinct persons. But the direction this evidence suggests is clear, and it is more interesting than the simplified biography that has circulated for 50 years. Bruce Lee was Cantonese on his father's side. That part of the story is accurate and well supported. On his mother's side, he carried the genetic signature of a family that had been shaped by one of the most unusual demographic environments in modern Asian history. His martial arts were Chinese, rooted in Wing Chun, transformed by his own relentless experimentation into something that no tradition could fully claim. His philosophy drew on Taoism, Zen, Western existentialism, and his own lived experience of being categorized in ways that did not fit him. His body was the product of a training regimen that no existing tradition had designed, a synthesis of techniques and conditioning methods drawn from boxing, fencing, bodybuilding, and half a dozen martial disciplines that he refused to treat as separate. And his ancestry, it turns out, was exactly as layered as everything else about him. The textbooks gave you a nationality. The DNA gives you a history. And the history is the story of a city, a family, and a century of crossings that no single category was ever going to contain.